The point I tried to make in the book is that the Shia were not originally defined as a minority. They were part of a kind of elite Muslim subculture.
Were the Shi'as of colonial India a minority sect or a separate Qaum? And were they loyal to the British or waiting for a different kind of freedom?
And the other point you mentioned is they are also distancing themselves from Iraq and Iran.
In this episode of Thinking Islam, we turn to the history of Shi'a Islam in colonial India, the role of Ulama and madrasas, their ties to Najaf and Qom, and how Imam Husain became a model for the struggle against empire.
The Indian Shia throughout this period asserting the idea that they represent an autonomous form of leadership for the Shia. So in other words, the Shia can endure as a community without the guidance always coming from Najaf and Karbala. There were also, though, particular Mujtahids in India who never really studied in Najaf and Karbala.
Joining us is Professor Justin Jones of the University of Oxford, a historian of South Asian Islam and the author of Shi'a Islam in colonial India.
The Muslim League historically, since it was founded in 1906, had a number of Shia in very senior, visible roles, because Jinnah was effectively trying to hold together a very loose coalition of Muslim support, and therefore he did not want to engage the kind of Sunni Shia questions, so he sort of shunned their overtures.
Yeah, but he was also himself attacked because of being a Shia.
You're asking me very hard questions, Ahmad. You're doing very well.
So welcome, Professor Justin Jones, to Thinking Islam podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So just to begin our journey of exploration, as I was looking through your academic journey and your different publications, you have spent a major chunk exploring South Asian Shi'ism. So my first question would be, what made you go down this route? Why South Asian Shi'ism?
Thanks. Well, again, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here, and it's very nice to be able to speak to you. Honestly, it was a very long time ago now that I started this work. I did my PhD right back in the 2000s, and then, of course, in those years since, I've built on this with various bits and pieces and publications and so on. Right at the beginning, when I was young, probably a couple of things were sort of happening that occurred to me. So, firstly, I was sort of trained up in Indian history, really. And it became very clear to me as a graduate student that the whole kind of language that kind of dominates partition studies in particular of the kind of Muslim nation and the two-nation theory and so on, once you start looking into local contexts, you start to see how that fractures. And I was looking particularly at cities like Lucknow, where there was a very strong sense of the distinctions of the Shia community versus other Muslims and so on. So I guess I became interested at that point in this division between, if you like, the kind of principles of the political language, but the actual realities on the ground. So that was sort of one reason I got into this area. The other thing that I think probably hung over everything back in the 2000s was the Iraq War and the way in which the Sunni and the Shia communities were written about in Iraq in the years after, which was often very much through the lens of kind of security studies. And the Shia community was often talked about in the news in a very kind of homogeneous way, where it was very clear that what was happening in Iraq could not be understood in terms of the Shia being under one leadership, one faction. And the kind of internal dynamics of how Shi'ism was working looked to me to be very interesting. So I think what I ended up trying to do with my work in India was to get past some of these categories about Shia, Sunni, and whatever, try to look at one particular community in a local context and sort of look at the internal dynamics and build on that. And that was the direction I sort of took in my thesis. And then I sort of developed that in my later work as well.
As you also mentioned, is when we talk about Shi'ism, as it's generally about Iraq or Iran globally, that's how it's understood as being Shi'i. But you looked at Shi'ism in India or in Lucknow. So how was that? Was it a kind of a challenge? Because we also see that it must have been a bit difficult, because did any scholarship exist? Was it accessible to you? How was it, this whole journey?
Yeah, again, it's a good question. And again, at the particular moment I was starting to work on this, which was the 2000s, a lot of the literature then on Shia studies had really been generated in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and the Iraq War, and it was very transnationally focused. And I think as well, because the 1990s, 2000s were, academically speaking, an era when a lot of the language was about globalization, there had been a lot of work which had tried to center Shi'ism as a kind of global, sort of really thinking about it as a global religion centered in its core heartland of Iraq and Iran. There was, I remember one book that I worked on a lot for my PhD by Meir Litvak on Shias in Iraq. And he talked about a concentric circles approach. So, Najaf represents a kind of cradle of the Shia world, and then that circle radiates outwards to other parts of the world. Now, that's one thing, and there are, of course, elements of truth in that. But also, I think and I thought at that point, it's very important as well to acknowledge the autonomy and the self-generation of particular Shia communities in other parts of the world. And so there has been another body of literature on the so-called other Shias, thinking about other Shia communities around the world, in their own sort of settings, their own forms of organization. And I guess at that point, there really wasn't much for India in the period I was looking at, which did that. And so I think that was sort of what I aimed to do, was kind of reestablish the Shi'ism not simply as a kind of transnational religion centered in Iraq, but as a religion which took its own forms and its own shapes and its own organizations within the indigenous context of India as well.
And so, as you kind of read about certain things, and then you go on to approach certain things in the field of academia as well. So you were reading about Shi'ism in the books, which was focused towards globalization, and then you went to research about South Asian Shi'ism. What was some of the differences that you felt in the sense of what you read and what's actually about South Asian Shi'ism, which is different from the mainstream Shi'ism or the central Shi'ism in terms of because you have mentioned, I just want to say that you have mentioned that Shi'ism has often been interpreted with the mold that privileges discussion of Iran and Atabat Alayat, the shrines of southern Iraq, over the regions in which it exists. Such a perspective, of course, risks relegating India to the periphery of the Shia mental and religious universe. So in that sense of when you bought into this universe, what was a different part about this universe?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for quoting my work back at me that I've not read in a long time. Maybe the way to answer your question perhaps is to think about the studies of Indian Shi'ism that existed at the point at which I started my own work. So the study that I think really captivated me at that point was Juan Cole's very rich and excellent and ongoingly important work on Shi'ism in the Indian state of Awadh, which maybe is a way into your question. So Awadh, through the 18th and 19th centuries, was one of the world's most important Shia-ruled states, internationally speaking. And Juan Cole, in his book, and very correctly, emphasizes the strong links that were built between Awadh and then the Shia centers further west, particularly in Najaf and Karbala, also in Iran, and so on. And so at that point, he was very interested in the kind of transnational traffic, the movement of scholars, of learning, of pilgrimage, of ideas, backwards and forwards, across Asia, really. Now, that book carries through the whole period of Awadh up until it was very abruptly annexed by the British in 1856. The state effectively is dismembered. Indian Shi'is from that point effectively are diminished from being a kind of elite Muslim subculture, very much tied to the state, to becoming a minority community in colonial terms. A minority among Muslims, and then Muslims as minority among the kind of Hindu majority of North India. So I think what I wanted to do with the book at that point was to pick up that story. What happens to Shias after that? How does Shias adjust from being, the kind of elite of a state into a community? And so my argument there was they sort of really pick up many of the kind of indigenous forms of communal organization, which we see in other communities as well, but they are taken up particularly by Shias. So, Shias go effectively in 1856 from having most of their communal and religious institutions closed down and a lot of their leaders sent into exile to a community that reinstitutionalizes itself. So you get the formation of Shia schools, You get the reinvigoration of culture such as Muharram. You get the Shia scholars and the Ulama forming new platforms and podia in order to speak. You get the increasing use of Urdu, the kind of lingua franca of North India, as a mode of religious communication, rather than the Arabic and Farsi, which had previously been the dominant languages of learning. You get, if you like, the use of all the opportunities of the North Indian public sphere. So it takes the Shia a little longer, I think perhaps because their community organization was, historically speaking, so tied up with the state and the existence of a Shia state. But by the 1880s, you start to see significant moves to the creation of Shia madrasas in North India. So it's in the 1880s, you see the first one created in Lucknow, which is called the Madrasa Nazmiya, created by one of the city's sort of most exalted scholars. There's another one a few years later called the Sultan al-Madaris, which again was kind of founded on donations from the former royal family of Awadh. And then some years later, you have the most important school of the Shia, which was called the Madrasat al-Vaizin, the school of preachers, which trains those scholars to a fairly high level. So the creation of madrasas becomes one of the kind of key crucibles of the creation of a Shia collective identity through the propagation of education. Now, in the book, I make a few arguments about these. So one is, I argue that they create an increasingly kind of indigenously formed curricula. So they use a series of legal works and works of hadith and so on produced by Indian clergy. I also suggest that they rely much less on direct input from scholars further west in Iraq. They're led by particular kind of figureheads and mujtahids within India. And also they standardize the forms of education in the way that, say, Deoband does. So they set up systems of examination, they set up collective teaching, they break from the old idea of the ustad and the shagird, the kind of pupil-student relationship that had dominated in old Awadh. And they also increasingly, if you like, segment Sunni and Shi'i religious education.
Which wasn't there before in Awadh, you mean to say?
In Awadh, there had been some mixing. So, for example, some Shi'a scholars had gone for study in the rational sciences to the Sunni Farangi Mahal school. Sunni scholars also trained under the Shi'i because there was a Muslim courtly elite who could be Sunni, could be Shia, but they could share a lot in the same sort of disciplines of learning. Now, after the 1850s and 1860s, you see that those two paths increasingly diverge. And so the Shia schools take in Shia students for a comprehensive training in subjects such as hadith and fiqh, on which Shi'ism, of course, diverges significantly from the Hanafi Sunni traditions. So you see a kind of sectionalization of Muslim education. And then further to that, and again, this is not the direct outcome of the Shia schools, but I think it's an indirect outcome. You see actually segmenting of a lot of other kind of ulama-led institutions as well. So, for example, in the 1890s, there's the formation of an organization called the Nadwatul Ulama, which at the point of its creation by the leader Shibli Nomani, it was intended to be a kind of collective organization which would represent all the maslaks and madahib of the Muslims. Now, you find that quite quickly the Shia depart from that because they don't find it a fitting environment for their own particular identity. And so I think one of the stories that you do see in the late 19th century is this kind of sectionalization of education by which, particular schools within Sunni Islam have their own institutions, but likewise the Shia themselves sort of, tread their own path in thinking about their curriculum of learning.
So even the Shias were maintaining the identity by not being with the Sunnis, not being with the Britishers as well, by opposing the Western education the way they were. And the other point you mentioned is they are also in the sense of distancing themselves from Iraq and Iran.
Yeah.
Why was that they focused more on their own scholars and their own work?
That again is, that was certainly one of the main arguments I tried to get across in the book, because as I mentioned earlier, at the point I was doing my research, there was a strong sense that Shi'ism was somehow a uniquely transnational religion by virtue of its links to Iran and Iraq, particularly in this period, Iraq. And then the argument I tried to put across is not that Indian Shias actually sever themselves from Iraq, but instead they decide that they do need a kind of working set of indigenous institutions which can provide a kind of collective leadership to the Shia within India. So it's that search for kind of indigeneity as well as the transnational identity. And there are a few things that make this necessary. The first, of course, is the kind of new communitarian language that emerges within Shia reformism in the colonial period, by which the Shias see themselves as a kind of wider community rather than just a kind of subculture led by a small religious elite. So, of course, therefore, you do need schools because all of those members of the community cannot travel to Iraq. So that's sort of one reason. Another is that actually it became increasingly clear that it was increasingly difficult for Shias in this period to have educational access to Iraq for a few reasons. So one was that after the British annexed Awadh, a lot of the funding that previously funded Shia scholars and and students to travel to Iraq dried up. So the kind of there was a big kind of a waqf, an endowment in Awadh called the Awadh bequest. The so-called Indian fund within that funded a lot of this pilgrimage was largely vanquished. So actually a lot of Indians did not have any resources to go to Iraq anymore. And a lot of the Indian students and scholars who were in the Atabat, in the shrine cities in Iraq, couldn't get back because they didn't have the resources to come back. So there were financial aspects that blocked it off. There were the political the political turmoil in the region because of this kind of British and Ottoman rivalry, which made the travel very difficult. There were a series of big restrictions on travel because of plague and the kind of quarantine regulations that the British put in place on pilgrims and so on. So for a lot of reasons, it was becoming increasingly difficult for Indians to travel to Iraq. Now, there were still some very big clerical families, some of which we might be able to talk about, who did continue to sort of maintain these links, and many did sort of stay in Najaf and Karbala, and many trained under the Mujtahids and the Hausa and so on. But for a large kind of majority of the Shia, that was simply not workable. And so I think what was happening in India was this attempt to build up a series of institutions that could give the Shia a kind of indigenous leadership within India. So we've talked about the madrasas, which sort of set up a kind of indigenous educational network for the Shia. You find in the colonial period that a lot of the key religious operatives who worked as, for example, Vaiz preachers or Zakirs, kind of sermonizers, as Ulama, many of them never went to Iraq at all. But you also get a series of kind of public sphere organizations, such as, Shia orphanages, Shia charities, and in particular, an organization known as the Shia Conference, which sort of represented Shia interests, all of which operated within a kind of Hindustani sphere. So one of the kind of main points I wanted to make in this book is that there is this articulation of a Hindustani Shi'ism, which is not set up as a kind of competitor or a rival to a kind of global Shi'ism or a kind of Iraqi center, but it's set up as an autonomous node, which could provide a form of leadership to the Shia within India.
And as you have mentioned also about this, how it was imbibed by the South Asian ulama and how some of them in their rulings also were quite differed in how it were there in Iraq or Iran. And some of them also looks a bit progressive. For example, one of the ulama, Muhammad Ibrahim, on women's autonomy during colonial times, you mentioned that a noble woman who wished to go on Hajj but was forbidden from doing so by her husband. And Muhammad Ibrahim urged that since she has independent financial means, she should not be holden to him and should follow her own conscience. And for that time, it looks, even right now, we have these restrictions, and some of the Mujtahids in Iraq saying that she needs a mahram or a husband or somebody to go along in this journey. And you see how Mujtahids, and also on the cases of dowry, or also even congregational prayers, the Jummah prayers, where it was looked upon as political, and how the South Asian ulama said that we bring it back to the community angle. So how was this dynamics of South Asian ulama because when you look at some of the cases you have presented, they look, if I use the word, a bit more progressive than the traditional aspects of the ulamas back there in Iraq?
That's a big and interesting question, and maybe I could sort of break it down. So before I sort of address your very particular example here of Muhammad Ibrahim, who was one of the kind of key Mujtahids in North India in the 1870s, 1880s, it's probably worth sort of saying a few things about the particular sort of status and the role taken on by the senior Mujtahids of Shi'ism in that period. So the argument I sort of make, partly in the book, but then also in some other publications that I've produced since the book, is that back in the context of Awadh, the Shia Mujtahids, the kind of elites, were of course chiefly tied up to the state. So they were there as things like muftis and as qadis, who were there as state functionaries, effectively. Juan Cole talks a lot about this kind of state of Shia state formation and how the ulama were one of the major props of that. Now, of course, that function ceases to exist after 1856. And so the Shi'i ulama have to effectively restyle themselves, find new constituencies of meaning and take on effectively a different role. And what one finds is that they effectively recraft themselves away from being state functionaries to being the leaders, the social and spiritual leaders of the Shia community at large. So they do this in various ways. One, as I've mentioned, is the setting up of madrasas and the creation of public institutions by which the Shia can receive guidance in India. So that's one. Another, which you've alluded to quite directly here, is the issuing of fatwas. Now, of course, the Mujtahids in Awadh had worked as muftis. They had issued fatwas. But if you look at which fatwas have been published in that period, they're often very much geared towards the state. It's questions such as, can the state take interest on loans? Can it, work with Hindus? It's sort of largely kind of questions that deal with the higher levels of governance. Now, when those are no longer needed, by this period in the 1870s, 1880s, many of these fatwas are actually directed instead at lay Shia Mustaftis, those who are asking for questions on their own religious lives, their own religious behaviors, and seek guidance. And so the person you mentioned here, Muhammad Ibrahim, he was a descendant of one of the major kind of Shia families, the Shia clerical families of North India, known as the Khandan Ijtihad, who were really important in Awadh. And so he was a descendant, but unlike his forebears, he wasn't instructing the state. He was instructing those who wrote questions. And he was one example of a mujtahid who maintained what is written about as a daftar, an office. So he would receive, at that time, so he would receive questions. Some of these were brought to him in person by some of the kind of nobility around remaining in Lucknow. Others were sent in by telegram, by word of mouth. Others, I think, he even sort of sent back through printed communiques in the press. So these fatwa haven't been sort of systematically published in the way that, say, Deobandi ones have since then. But nevertheless, the accounts of this suggest that he was issuing thousands or tens of thousands of these fatwa, offering guidance at this time, offering guidance to the lay Shia. And you see this ever more strongly in later generations when, once again, the capacity for issuing fatwa and communicating the answers is ever bigger. So I think, so it's a kind of retraining. The Mujtahids have gone from being these kind of state advisors to being these kind of advisors of a Shia community.
Interesting. Yeah.
And on the reformist point that you make, it's interesting you should say that. Now, from the sources that I found these fatwa in, I suspect there's a little bit of self-selection here. I suspect that it's been in the interest of some later authors to preserve some of these more progressive ones.
Okay.
But at the same time, it also suggests from these questions that those in the 1870s, 1880s going to the Mujtahid are from the nobility. So the question of a noble woman going on Hajj is likely to be one of the kind of senior noble women of which Awadh did have, who had some kind of financial autonomy, some kind of independence, some kind of royal lineage, probably very strong contacts in that part of the world. The question might have been different for example, a poor woman, a standard kind of, a wife of an urban worker or something. But nevertheless, so there's a good piece of social history in this in terms of the kind of people who were asking for fatwa in the 1870s, 1880s. But I think as time goes on, you do see more of a sense of less simply the Sharif elite, not just the nobility, but actually a kind of wider spectrum of the middle classes seeking advice from the ulama and the mujtahids on their own conduct.
Okay, after the middle class gets created in the colonization.
Yeah, once the print is there, once you have this kind of mobility of being able to travel, to ask questions, to write, I think that form of communication becomes much wider.
As you mentioned that, how there was this whole mujtahids, the daftar, and the whole khandan, a clan of ijtihad. Generally, in our imaginations, is that this mujtahids are centered towards also Iran and Iraq. Yeah. And the way you are telling is that functioning is happening in a proper way, that you have a daftar, you have different mujtahids, people approaching them. So currently, we don't see it happening this way. So through this, what was it in the colonial period that led to the formation of these daftars, which you already have mentioned, but what led to its decline, if I may ask, after my own curiosity?
Okay, so I won't pretend to be a huge expert on this topic, since much of the decline really happens in the post-colonial period. And of course, with my primary research, I kind of stop at around about that point. Yeah. But I can give a few indications of why that might be the case. So the first is I think the kind of traumas in North Indian Muslim politics, which begin particularly in the 1930s, 1940s, but then continue after independence. So with the rise of the Muslim League, the eventual outcomes of partition and so on, a lot of the sort of traditional structures of leadership and largesse break down within the Muslim community. So, yeah, particularly with the emigration of a lot of the Shia elite, with the kind of abolition of zamindari, of sort of large-scale landholding after 1947, you see a lot of the kind of patronage drying up. So, you know, financially, culturally, psychologically, I think there is a major decline in Indian Shi'ism that does happen. I think the point I tried to make in my book is that had always been assumed to happen actually after 1856. I don't think that's correct. I think it's later. I think it's from about the 1940s onwards that you see that major sense of decline. So from that point, of course, these religious institutions for the Shia continue to exist. You know, the madrasas I write about in the book continue to exist. These kind of circles of ulama leadership also continue to exist in North India. But I think increasingly, the Shia have been defined by some of the traumas that have affected the community, and also by an increasing discourse of kind of the minority. Because of course, you know, the point I tried to make in the book is that the Shia were not originally defined as a minority. They were part of a kind of elite Muslim subculture. The idea of the kind of politics of numbers is an innovation that comes in the colonial period and later. Whereas, of course, now in North India, the Shia are a minority among Muslims who themselves are a minority and often a very marginalized, beleaguered minority in contemporary India. So all these things have their impact. So while there are kind of vestiges of some of the kind of historic, you know, glories and achievements of Shi'ism in India, I think most would argue that there has been a kind of tangible decline. But I think it's mostly a post-colonial decline.
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting, is that you see all this development taking place during colonization. And as soon as colonization stops, where people are said to be free and attain freedom, you see a proper decline in all of these activities slowly.
This is still true, which, by the way, is not to say anything very positive about the nature of the colonial state.
Yeah, I'm not saying, that's what it's purpose.
But the major social transitions that do accompany the kind of independence and the aftermath, I think, are major factors in the decline. I'll
get back on that. I also want to mention this, which you have mentioned, a story of the grafted hand. The story of a man who had grafted the hand of a corpse whose hand was chopped in a battle. And so he asked a fatwa from Muhammad Taqi in Lucknow. And then about how... So first of all, this is also very fascinating, that a dead man's hand grafted on somebody's hand at that time. So, I don't know what technology was, but
I cannot tell you how surprised I was when I found that story. But nevertheless, that story is at least recorded.
Yeah, it's recorded. And then the person asks the Mujtahid whether he can do the ibadats, like worshipping ablution, on the grafted hand. And then one Mujtahid gives one opinion, Muhammad Taqi, and Sheikh Zainul Abdin Mazandarani, who was Hayri, who was one of the biggest Mujtahids. I think he was also responsible for the transition of Khoja Shias from Ismaili to Ithna Ashri.
Correct.
he gave a different opinion.
Yeah.
And then when he was asked, it was said that hum rijal wa nahnu rijal, so which you have also mentioned, wo mard maidan apni jagah, hum mard maidan apni jagah. There was a disagreement as well, but that was also looked upon as something that was acceptable.
Yeah.
Which currently we don't see that much, that two ulamas disagreeing, one would be wrong and one would be right. But here you see a completely different approach. It's like, yeah, the difference of opinion can exist. It gives a completely different picture of how. So how did you come across this, or your own journey of exploring this?
This, I have to say, I'm very impressed by the level to which you've been reading my work, and I haven't discussed or thought about this story in some years now. That is an interesting story. It is. I forget. I can't mentally work out exactly what the date was that would have happened, but Muhammad Taqi, to whom it refers, was quite an early mujtahid. I mean, you're talking 1860s, 1870s, something like that.
Yeah.
Now, that story is recorded in a kind of later biographical work about Muhammad Taqi, written by one of his descendants. Now, I think as well, this sort of plays into the argument I've made here that actually the Indian Shia throughout this period are asserting the idea that they represent an autonomous form of leadership for the Shia. So in other words, the Shia can endure as a community without the guidance always coming from Najaf and Karbala, because the Indian Mujtahids are themselves marjas, and in some cases marja taqlid. You know, there were Mujtahids in the colonial period who did see themselves or were understood to be the kind of supreme forms of guidance for the Shia. So a story like this, I think, has been preserved because it represents that the Shia opinion within India does not have to be the same as the opinions coming out of the highest mujtahids in Iraq. So again, it's representing this idea that there can be a multipolar Shia world where the Shia within India can have their own autonomy. And I think, that has been quite instrumentally preserved to make that point.
Okay.
But nevertheless, I think that the point is maintained. And I think, as you say, it's done without that. It's not done in a way that is combative. It's suggesting that there can be different answers to the same questions.
Interesting. And about the ulamas, which you mentioned, is that we see, which you also mentioned, that there's different categories, like khatibs, wise, munazirins, mujtahids, ulama. So what was this different categories of what you would call it, like scholars or different roles that were taken? Or was this also a sense of which need were these different categories responding to, if I may ask?
You're asking me very hard questions, everybody. You're doing very well. Hang on, I'm gonna do this. Yes, I mean, you're right, and I cannot tell you when I was doing my research how complicated it is to work out which titles are being applied to who and whether it's legitimate and how many of them have substance and how many of them are simply kind of informal designations. It's extremely complicated. But you're quite right. Now, in the colonial period, there were a number of those who ascended to the rank of mujtahid, which, of course, in the Usuli Shia tradition is a fairly significant, form of title, which gives people the right to conduct ijtihad and to formulate serious points of law. So, of course, that was there. Now, there are plenty of those who at the time who argued that the word mujtahid was overused and that actually many of those who came to be mujtahid was more than the actual number who could. There were also, and I refer to some of these in some of my articles, there are those who would refute the claims of one mujtahid to actually be entitled to hold the title or entitled to conduct ijtihad in the way that they claimed. So there was always a lot of slippage between these titles. And I think in a way that's quite embedded in the whole model of Shia learning anyway, because of course in the Hausa system it was very based on individual ijaza from particular scholars. There were always claims they were forged or that the mujtahids weren't clear who they were. But the clearest summary one could give is that in the colonial period there were a large number of authenticated mujtahids whose claims were sort of earned in Najaf in particular. There were also, though, particular mujtahids in India who never really studied in Najaf and Karbala. So the key example here would be Nasir Husain, who was one of the key mujtahids in Lucknow. Kinturi, in the kind of 1900s onwards. He's probably the most sort of most exalted religious leader in Lucknow. Now, Well, I'm sure I mean, he did go to Iraq, but all of his studying and education happened under Mujtahids in India, such as under the Khandan Ijtihad and so on. And so he was not simply a Mujtahid, but he was a marja, and by some estimates, he was a marja al-taqlid. He was the supreme leader who effectively took the place of some of those in Iraq at the time for the Indian Shia. So there is huge complexity, but what was very clear to me was that, at least in the colonial period, there were still really high, exalted religious leaders who were parallel to those in the Atabat themselves. Now, at this other level that you refer to, those who might be Vaiz or Zakir or Khatib or whatever else, those were often quite informally designated, and they often referred not simply to one's educational qualifications, but to their skill set. There were those such as Sibte Hassan is one I talk about in the book, who was Khatib Azam, who was extremely well known as a Khatib simply through his powers of oratory and his ability to carry a crowd. And biographies of him talk about his abilities to sort of captivate an audience and to sort of tailor his words and so on and so forth. So those are kind of sort of fairly informal designations. But I mean, another point one could make here is that one of the purposes that the madrasas within India had tried to solve was by standardizing forms of qualification in the way that Deoband had for the Sunnis.
Okay.
So they created these qualifications such as Mumtaz al-Fazil, Sadr al-Fazil. There were a few, but sort of titles where, people would have, students would receive certificates, clear qualifications of learning, which would give them a certain sort of level that could be more widely understood. So there was actually, while there were a huge number of informal titles floating around for any one individual, there were also these attempts to formalize a kind of clear system of designation in this era.
And it was under the impact of Deoband, so you can say.
I think it was an increasing sense that if the community was to have its own leadership, it also needed to be able to categorize the kind of qualifications and the titles and the level of its different personnel. So I think it was part of a kind of wider culture which came to the public sphere and was not distinctive to the Shia, but was also taken up by the Shia, of this need for kind of formalization and bureaucratization. And this applies to the Sunnis, but it also applies to the Shias as well.
So was these khatibs, wazins also among Deoband, or was there something specially to Shi'is giving because here you see that centralization of the skills of oratory, like given an importance, because this shows that generally even somebody who is knowledgeable may not be a good speaker.
Yeah.
That's not an essential criteria. But these titles show that there was a significant attention given to oratory, which was also recognized, as we said, like Sayyid Sibte Japar was said that he was Khatib Azam. So this skill was centralized. Is it something specific to this South Asian subcontinent that these skills also gained a prominence?
I think so. I mean, if I may, I'll just sidestep discussing the kind of Sunni equivalents, because these words like, Khatib and Zakir in particular, they're so particular in their meaning to kind of the notion of Shia ibadat, and they're very particularly tied to formats such as the Majlis and the reading of Marsiya. So these are very, as I understood them and as I wrote about them, they are very much embedded within a kind of Shia worldview. So I'll stick to discussing just the Shia here. But I think, in my book, I did sort of explore why there is so much emphasis upon public communication and upon oratory in this period. And I think there are various reasons. I think the first is that there is increasingly this attempt to define the Shia not simply as just a Sharif elite, but as a kind of wider Qaum or a community within India. And that, of course, means that, one engages not simply the Sadat, the kind of leaders, but also the Mu'mineen, the kind of the common people or the followers within the community. And this, it was seen, meant getting beyond simply the written word, but actually to the spoken word, to the public space, to the imambara, to the idgah, to the masjid, to the mimbar, and so on. So that's sort of one reason. Another point that I sort of tried to make in parts of the book is that particularly by about the 1910s, 1920s, there is an emphasis across religious communities in India of reaching out to others. In Islam more broadly, it's talked about as tabligh, the idea of proselytization, tabligh. In in Hinduism, you had the kind of equivalent idea of shuddhi, but the idea of reaching out beyond the kind of the high caste elite to a kind of wider population, including the lower castes. Now, this was also happening in Shi'ism. So the Madrasatul Vaizin, which I sort of mentioned before, it's a school that puts a great deal of emphasis upon the training in public communication and public oratory. You have in the 20s and 30s an increasing, if you like, the sending out of zakirs and so on away from just Lucknow into UP, as far as Peshawar and Punjab and Burma and elsewhere, sort of carrying messages, being hired as kind of rentier-seeking sermonizers, effectively. And you also have, very interestingly for me, a minority, but also a significant push for actual religious proselytization and almost conversion. There's an increasing emphasis on converting Sunni Muslims to Shi'ism. There's an increasing emphasis upon reaching out to Hindu untouchables with kind of the messages of the Imams and so on. And that is interesting, not simply because it's very new in Shi'ism, but it really breaks down what Shi'ism was, because Shi'ism in the subcontinent had always been associated very much with the highborn. But this attempt to reach out to the lowborn meant a completely elemental transformation in what the Shia community was. So I think the fact, I'm going back to what your original question was, I think the fact that the community does put so much emphasis on oratory, on spokesmanship, on communication, says something really profound about the transformation that had been made within Indian Shi'ism away from being just an elite subculture to being a religion in the way that we understand it now.
As you have mentioned also, is that in your chapter of how the Shias were now appearing as a Judagana Qaum in 20th century, say that Shia orators framed their distinctness as member of an independent religious equivalent in its terminological standing to Sikhism, Hinduism, or Christianity, almost implied the Shia to be a different religious system rather than a sect. So this realization, which we also were talking before this, we started the podcast, is that as you mentioned, that generally we looked, not generally, but somebody or in common understanding, the Shi'ism is a sect under the broader category of Muslim. But as you mentioned also, this preaching or the way it was going to the lower caste during the colonial period, or Shi'ism not just being restricted to elite, they are developing a sense of community which doesn't look at themselves just as a sect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole language of sect and sectarianism, which has often been imposed upon the study of Shi'ism, is of course very problematic, because of course the idea of the Shia as a sect, say a firqa, something like that, that's coming out of anyway a particular really Sunni vision of history, which has also been taken up in a lot of Western mindsets, where the Shia is seen as a numerical minority, and therefore they need to be understood as a firqa. Now that language was never really there, for understandable reasons, within the Shia in India. Now, one of the arguments I make in the book is that there were many ways in which the Shia did talk about themselves. It was not as firqa, but they could talk about themselves as a jamaat, as a maslak, as a millat, as the Ahl-e-Tashi. There were lots of words. And that kind of heterogeneous vocabulary never disappears. That was maintained throughout the period I studied. But what really struck me was the take-up of the term Qaum, which effectively kind of means a kind of essential community. It's a kind of the idea of this being a fundamental essence of identity. And that appears particularly in Urdu publications and particularly those engaging the public sphere in some way. So the Shia Conference is one example of an organization that predominantly speaks about the Shia Qaum. Shia-run newspapers also talk about the Qaum in tandem with the millet and so on. And the words in the context in which it was being used for the Shia had been used for Muslims to denote the Muslims as an essential kind of community, really. So Syed Ahmed Khan had famously spoken about the Muslims as a Qaum, a nation, but it also talks about India as a Qaum. So the language between what is a community, what is a nation, what is a group, what is a caste, that's very variable, but Qaum is kind of the essential pillar of the kind of foundational brick of identity, if you like. And so by talking about themselves as a Qaum, the Shia were distinguishing themselves as you say, kind of as on the basis of judagana, of separateness, of this being a distinct community. Now that I think was new in the colonial period, and it's important not just because it shows how the Shia exercise their self-awareness, but it's because the Qaumi identity becomes the foundation for the idea that the Shia needed their own institutional infrastructure as a community. They needed their own Shia conference, they needed their own Shia schools, their own madrasas, their own printing presses, their own newspapers. So, it underpins a whole kind of scaffolding of identity, if you like.
Well, in that sense, is that just I'm asking you because you have also worked in, so Deobandi, Barelvi, they also developed their own institutions, on publications, on scholars. But did they consider themselves also a separate Qaum as the Shias consider themselves as a separate Qaum?
That's a good question. I think the difference is that something like, say, the Deobandi or the Barelvi, these are effectively particular orientations within a madhab, within the kind of the Hanafi line of learning. So in effect, it's not equivalent to what I was talking about in my book, which is effectively a kind of blending of a secular and a religious model of identity. Because I think for historic reasons among the Shia, you did not see that such a clear separation of the secular and the religious elite in the way that you do within Sunni Islam. Among the Shia, they remain much more intertwined, I think, because of the historic ties, the patronage, the social role of the ulama, and so on and so forth. So I think the Qaum is much more totalizing. So, there was, of course, as I mentioned already, there was a language among Saad Ahmed Khan and the modernists of the kind of Indian Muslims as a Qaum. And I think what happens among the Shia, in a way, actually parallels that much more.
And also, because of this, Qaum has an interesting qualities also. For example, which you have mentioned, there was a strategic loyalty to the British Raj. Because after the revolt of 1857, although both Shia Sunni participated, but it was considered, which you have mentioned, as a Sunni fanaticism. And which Hunter's categorization was also that it's mostly Wahhabi Shias, and which are maybe a threat, but the Shias are inherently more loyal, and Shias also adopted this political quietism, which is also there in the Ittihad newspaper, which you have mentioned, that they said that since they have never gone against our imams and they have never oppressed us, so why do we want to revolt against them? And then it was said that among Muhammadans, the Shias alone are true loyal subjects of the British government and will never make jihad. So this looks quite interesting about how we generally looked at the colonial history, the intricacies you're drawing up.
Yeah, I mean, a sort of pretext to answering your question is that much of the literature that existed on Shi'ism at the point I was doing my research, as I sort of already mentioned, was coloured by the assumptions that came out of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And that, of course, saw Shi'ism as a doctrine of social protest, of revolution, Islam, of a kind of nascent political Islam, and so on and so forth. And so actually the colonial story that emerged was quite surprising to me at that point, but it really shows how many of these kind of political realities are actually not essential teachings, but products of a particular moment. So the way in which you sort of frame my argument there is quite correct. So what happens is that after 1857, which was seen to have been, that War of Independence was seen by the British to have been a particularly Muslim War of Independence. There is a British obsession with the question of loyalty and working out which Muslim groups are loyal and which aren't. Now, of course, Sunnis, Deobandis, Wahhabis become the kind of if you like, the kind of the pinnacle of danger for the colonial state. Others, such as the Sufis and the Shi'i, rightly or wrongly, become assumed to be the more loyal, the more pliant, and a whole kind of particular reading of Shia doctrine falls into this because the British are informed by the most loyal of their Shia interlocutors that because of the absent Imam there cannot be a Shia jihad and no one has the ability to declare it, which of course historically speaking is untrue, but nevertheless that was the argument put across by many loyal Shias in India at the time. So in the book I do talk about this. I suggest that many Shia very tactically played to being more loyal, particularly in the 1910s. So in the 1910s, you have the kind of so-called pan-Islamic movement, where a lot of Sunni leaders, most famously the brothers Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, who actually ironically were half Shi'i, but that's another question. But there was a kind of wide-scale Sunni-based pan-Islamic movement which rallied to the Ottoman Khilafat and talked about the legitimacy of a jihad as a form of agitation against the colonial state. Now, at that point, many of the Shia elites who had a vested interest in their proximity to the colonial state and thought that the best interests for the Shia was to keep close to the colonial regime as a minority, felt that sort of depicting themselves as kind of anti-jihadi was the most pragmatic political response. So you had Urdu tracts at this point which emphasized that under the Shia doctrine of taqlid, or deference, you could not possibly declare a jihad. Again, largely false, but it was put across in writing at that particular point. You also had, importantly, the strong dissociation from many Shia leaders from the Khilafat movement. So, of course, the Khilafat movement was a mostly Sunni Muslim agitation, which rallied in support of the Ottoman Sultan in the context of the First World War, and used this as a kind of way of embedding a Muslim voice within the non-cooperation movement of Mahatma Gandhi and engaging in the kind of in this kind of cross-communal agitation at the time. Now, while many Shia did in fact engage in that because they thought that allying with the anti-colonial movement was pragmatically very important, some of the kind of major Shia Mujtahids of this era and many of the old Shia landholders actually suggested that on the basis of Shia beliefs, the Shia should not become too involved in the Khilafat movement and should remain aloof from it. And in fact, there were rumors that circulated in the Shia press at the time that the Ottomans had dismembered the holy cities, they had stolen treasures from Najaf. There were all these kind of stories put across to try to encourage the Shia to remain opposed to the Khilafat movement. It was ultimately unsuccessful. Many Shia did join the Khilafat movement, but often very late and in a largely marginal way.
Because you also mentioned that the Nasir Hussain, Aka Hassan, Muhammad Baqir Rizvi, they gave a statement that they should keep aloof from the Khilafat movement, and because according to the Shias, there is no Caliph. They use the religious language. Also, what is interesting is because of in this, what you call it, having the separate identity. One is just saying that since we are a separate Qaum, we'll respond separately. So we won't respond as the other Muslims have responded to, maybe. But it's also that during that time, like Mujtahids in Iran and Shirazi, they also had quite a anti-colonial stand.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was going around, like Jamaluddin Afghani and all those people were going around talking about that stance against the tobacco revolution and all. So there was this anti-colonial stand, which was a part of Shi'ism. But this Hindustani Shi'ism, or which the ulamas, took a completely different role, which was also not opposed to the Sunni ulamas, but also the Shi'i ulamas in the epicenter of Iran and Iraq.
Yeah. No, I mean, the connection you sort of make there with, if you like, a kind of transnational Shia activism is quite striking because, of course, you had Mirza Hassan Shirazi and the tobacco concessions in Iran in the 1890s. You have the really strong role of some of these figures in the Iranian constitutional revolution as well. So Ayatollah Muhammad al-Naini and plenty of others. So Shi'ism at this point, historically, had really been quite politically radical. And it was quite interesting that in this particular pocket of North India, that hadn't really been the case. They had tied much more to a much more politically conservative role. Now, strangely, they had actually drawn from some of these figures further west in the sense that they were crafting themselves as wider social leaders. So they were reaching out to the community. I think I say in the book at one point that they had sort of built themselves a Bazari following in a similar way, where these new mujtahids had found themselves a public constituency of support. But they remain much more politically quietist. And I think that really is just the reasons of pragmatism creeping in, that they felt that at that point the best interest of the North Indian Shia was to remain aloof. But of course, that's the point probably at which that hold of opinion broke. So what I also say in the book is that by about 1920, there was a lot of pressure, not just from kind of young agitationalists within North India among the Shia, but also from South India who did get involved in the Khilafat movement. So there were some major preachers in Bombay in particular who became very strong Khilafatists. And so by about 1921, the Mujtahids effectively lose ground, and they do I mean, U-turn is too strong a word, but they effectively give way. And there is kind of a Shia agitation in North India. Mm-hmm. And I think from about the 1920s, the kind of say or the power of that particular generation of Mujtahids no longer holds. And so the 20s and 30s is much more chaotic. And I suspect that the Khilafat movement is one of the moments at which that particular generation of Mujtahids loses its grip.
Oh, so okay, interesting.
I think.
That's interesting.
I would say don't quote me on this, but I realize I'm on record now.
That's interesting. So now we go to the next part. I would want to have more discussion, but given the framework, we have to go to the next section, is on Pakistan, which in your book you mentioned. I like the phrase that Pakistan that is going to be Sunnistan is actually said by the Shia conference. That so on the one hand, which is Indian Shia responses to Pakistan movement. On the one hand, which is there in your book, is the Shia role in the Muslim League, where they were quite elitists like Aga Khan, Mahmudabad, Raja Qazilbash, Amir Alina. So all these were there in the Muslim League.
Yeah.
And then you had this Shia conference. So what was Shia conference saying that Muslim League is not the right representative of the Shias?
It's interesting. When I did start my PhD many, many years ago now, I actually started with the Shia role in the Pakistan movement, and then I actually ended up not using it in the book because a lot of the kind of archival and Urdu materials that I did use in the book, effectively by the 40s they dry up because of the nature of the war and everything like that. So in the end, I sort of left out that whole period. I published it subsequently somewhere else, but the position of the Shia within the Pakistan movement is, of course, something of massive historical consequence. So I'll sort of summarize sort of my take on this. So yes, you're quite right that the Muslim League historically, since it was founded in 1906, had a number of Shia in very senior, visible roles. So yes, they include, the likes of the Nawabs of Rampur, the Rajas of Mahmudabad, later people like, Mirza Ahmed Isfahani in Bengal. Muhammad Ali Jinnah himself was from originally from the Ismaili Khoja community. So, and the Aga Khan, of course, had a major role in the Pakistan movement. So you're quite right that the Muslim League was actually disproportionately dominated by Shia voices. Now, one way of looking at that is to suggest that actually those major figures within India who happen to be Shia felt that they could be more powerful representatives by speaking not for the Shia as a minority, but speaking for the Muslims as a larger community. So I think actually there is a strong argument that many of the kind of most prominent Shia in India talked about themselves at the highest levels as Muslims. They might be religiously Shia, but in terms of their politics, they were Muslim politicians. And that applies to all the figures I've talked about there. So the Shia at the higher levels of the Muslim League were very prominently involved. However, my take on this was that actually slightly lower down in the Pakistan movement, so more at the provincial level, many Shia were extremely concerned about it because they had a stronger experience of being a minority at the hands of the Sunni majority. There was this kind of narrative that Pakistan would ultimately be a Sunni-dominated state, and that therefore, in effect, the Shia would be a minority within Pakistan in the same way as the Muslims faced being a minority in Hindustan. So many organizations did start to oppose the creation of Pakistan for these reasons. And the most prominent of these was an organization called the Shia Political Conference that is created in 1929. Originally, it's sort of created out of a Shia sort of elite section who are from Lucknow and Bombay for the most part. Initially, they tried to sort of ally themselves with the Muslim League to create a kind of Muslim space within the Muslim League. The Muslim League, however, itself is very fragile as a political party because Jinnah was effectively trying to hold together a very loose coalition of Muslim support. And therefore, he did not want to engage the kind of Sunni Shia questions. So he sort of shunned their overtures.
But he was also himself attacked because of being a Shia.
But he himself was also attacked for being a Shia, but he effectively tried to position these questions as ones that Pakistan could settle after its creation. He sort of argued that Muslims needed to seek Muslim unity. He talked about Islam in danger. He talked about the Muslims as a nation. The whole question of Sunni Shia was something that would be resolved later on, was the formal position of Jinnah and most of the major Muslim leaguers. So they kind of put the question aside. The Shia political conference also tried to sort of build support or build some kind of influence within Congress, but Congress, for their own reasons, also had no real interest. And so the Shia political conference really built up no serious base of influence. What it was asking for, however, was not like the Muslim League, a kind of separate Muslim nation, but it was starting to talk about something much more like the Congress, actually, where it was talking about what it called a joint electorate for the whole Indian Muslim population, but reserved seats. So some seats would be just for Muslims, some just for Hindus, so different from the kind of separate electorate system of the British. In fact, what it was closest to, I sort of suggest in an article I've written on this, is it was closest to the untouchable activism that had been led by Ambedkar, who again had pushed forward in the 1930s for the ideas that some seats would have a shared electorate, but that all the candidates would be untouchables, so reserved seats. They said the same for Muslims, for Shias, and all the rest of it. So again, it was one of these ironic touch points that you get at various junctures, where the Shia, despite holding so tightly to their sharif, their noble status, link themselves in activism to the untouchables, the most kind of marginalized of communities, as a way of trying to find a political space for themselves. And so the Shia political conference at points links itself, it links the Shia to the untouchables within Hinduism, also to, I think at this point, to Jews within Europe, to Protestants in Ireland. They come up with all these metaphors for their minority status, but none of these stick. And so really, despite its valiant campaigns, the Shia political conference never actually finds a way of imposing itself within the debate. Pakistan happens without any kind of serious Shia voice. And then those questions are left both in India and Pakistan until after partition, where, of course, they've remained extremely difficult and divisive.
Yeah. In your book, you mentioned how Husain, I think what's exact. Hussain Boy Lalji mentions that Pakistan would establish a government of Sunni Janta by Sunni Janta and for Sunni Janta. Shias in it, the total would be in total annihilation of their faith, their culture, and their individuality. So in that sense, a part of it was also realized that apprehensions of Shia conference wasn't very misplaced, given how the history unfolded and what Shias in Pakistan have faced. But you also see that in your book, if you draw the categorization, which you also mentioned, is that there is these elites, Muslim League elites. And when you are elite, you rise beyond Shia Sunni.
Yeah.
Because generally, as Nietzsche also has said, like, morality is for slaves.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, they hold the barrier of it. But when you go down the line, or it was the lower strata, if I may say, of the social class or the social hierarchy, the lived reality is different. Yeah. And in that sense, we can say that the Shias of maybe the undivided India have the apprehension that it will be quite difficult for them to, if Pakistan is created. And it was their aspiration which was never heard, and which also resounded with which you mentioned, the alliance with the Untouchables, or which were called the Achuts during that time. The term is not to be used anymore now, but it was how it was termed at now, or the Dalits, we say. Yeah. What was interesting, you said that the Shias found them together, and there was the invocation of Imam Husain as a model for lower caste emancipation. Also, you have mentioned how, but I'm still trying to understand, like, how was this solidarity came into being of allyship between the Untouchables or the lower caste and the Shias?
Sure, and there's a few things I could pick up there. Yeah, absolutely. It is a strange alliance, and it's not one that is consistent, but it is one that has appeared at various junctures. And I think it's to do with what is seen as the close analogy between the relationship between a Sunni majority and a Shia minority, and a kind of Hindu majority and an untouchable community, next to or within themselves. So I think that close analogy of experience is one that they've played on. So in the colonial period, there were a few places I found where actually, even say the Shia Mujtahids take up the questions of the Untouchables quite directly. So there is one particular Mujtahid in Lucknow, Aka Hassan, who shares platforms with Untouchables. He talks about the ability of Muslims to dine with Untouchables, to share the same wells, and so on. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Shia Political Conference likewise links its struggle quite indirectly, but through a similar sort of set of strategies to Ambedkar's movement. But another aspect, actually, that you alluded to in your question is about, it links to something I said a little while back, but actually about how the idea that Shi'ism is increasingly defined not simply as a kind of a religion or a creed that only applies to the kind of social elites, but as something that can be genuinely universal and with a message to everyone. And a particular kind of reference point here might be a sort of later mujtahid of the kind of mid to late 20th century, Ali Naqi Naqvi, who again was a member of one of the major families from Lucknow. Now, in the 1940s, and this isn't in the book, but I write about it elsewhere, he looks to the model of Imam Husain in a new way, not simply, as many had, as a kind of embodiment of the Shia experience of marginalization and trauma and martyrdom, but as actually a universal figurehead for all of mankind, and as a bringer of equality and justice and all the rest of it. And so in the 1940s, right at the height of the Quit India movement and everything else like that, he organizes a so-called Husain Day, which celebrates kind of the anniversary of Husain's life, but it propounds that Imam Husain's message is one for all people. And so the idea here is that this is reaching out not just to the Shia, but to Hindus, to Sunnis, to the international community, to Christians. That message is seen as universal. And that has been something that has sort of been repeated since then. And it's sort of linked to this sort of increasing sense, I think, that Shi'ism carries within it a universal message of social justice. Now, another link that I kind of alluded to in one paper, and that I know has sort of been picked up on in India a couple of times, actually, is that message of Imam Husain as a revolutionary figure, which comes out of a very particular Indian context in the 1940s, circulates internationally. And there are sort of quite direct parallels between how that appears in India and then how it starts to get reused in countries like Iran and also in this sort of international community later on, where, you have this turn to a kind of more revolutionary Shi'ism, which is embedded more in a language of universalism and social justice.
Okay, so you're saying that it started in India and then it was taken to this interpretation of Imam Hussain as a revolutionary leader, as a political leader, which was then seen in Mutahari's work or Shariati's work.
Yeah.
But it started with...
I won't go as far to say that's definitely correct, but I will say there are ways in which it could be correct, and I've heard that said by Shias in India.
Okay.
Make of that what you will.
Well, I disagree. But I'm just... the reason why I'm saying is the very institution of this caste system is what it brings about this notion of untouchability or the lower caste, the Dalits. And Shias having an alliance with it, but Shias in South Asia is a highly categorized society.
Yeah.
Like they maintain the Sayyids or the Khandans or the Sharifs or the elites. So that was what was perplexing for me. Like at one level, something is so essential to South Asian Shiism is the different way the caste system operates, or the Sayyids or the non-Sayyids, the Ashrafs or the non-Ashrafs, or the elites or the non-elites. But at the same time, they're also having this alliance with this.
Yeah, it's a complete ambivalence and paradox, and that struck me too. But again, the kind of bridge to understanding it is maybe what I was saying earlier, which is this idea that the Shia are no longer to be defined just as Sharif; they are to be defined as a Qaum. And when the Shia do talk about themselves as a Qaum, they talk about the Sadatwa al-Mu'minin, so both the kind of leaders and the followers of the community. And so the space for how you define Shiism really opens up. And I think that makes maybe more space for social association that hadn't been there maybe back in the Nawi period.
And which you mentioned about Ali Naqi Naqvi. Ali Naqi Naqvi also uses the Imam Hussain model to come close to Congress, as you have mentioned in the book.
Absolutely, yeah.
What was the basis of coming close to Congress and Imam Hussain, if you like to share with us, if you remember?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, again, that speaks to the dissociation that happened between the Shia and the Muslim League. I think it maybe speaks to, at that point, Congress's ongoing aspirations to maintain the voice of all Indians across community, rather than simply being the Hindu party that the Muslim League had characterized them as. And I think it speaks to that, that attempt to kind of find a universal message that sort of characterized the discourse at that period.
So the universalism of Congress opposed to the religious factionism Muslim League. So Imam Hussain would side towards the universalism.
But then, of course, on the other side, you had other Shias who talked about Imam Hussain as really a kind of vanguard of revolution and social justice, and that fed into the Pakistan movement. So effectively, the message of Karbala could be applied on all sides of a political debate, as we have seen in many examples.
Yeah, that's true. So given in your own, because you have, I think through your book, we have, like many of the scholars have been introduced to us, which was your particular favorite scholar, if I'm allowed to say that, in your journey of discovering different scholars in South Asia?
My own favorite.
If there was someone who...
That's difficult. Oh, I mean, favorite is definitely not a word I will use or answer
maybe
to.
Someone
the most captivating or interesting. I mean, I think I would probably flag as a collective the kind of Khandan Ijtihad family, because they are so traceable across so many generations. And there was an article that I published on the Khandan Ijtihad, which came out in 2020, but I think I started it in 2006. So that remains my slowest ever publication, just because I never really finished it and I kept coming back to it at different moments. But the way in which that family kind of exemplify a long story within Shi'ism, where you start with a figure like Dildar Ali Nasir Abadi, who becomes the kind of key progenitor of Shia state formation right back in the 1780s. He studied in Iraq. He brought the message to Awadh. His family kind of led the Shia state in Awadh until the 1850s. That family then became the foremost family within, or one of the foremost families within the Shia clerical elite in North India, as the kind of the Peshnawas of Friday prayers, as kind of the issuers of Fatawi, the leaders of the schools. It leads on to Ali Naqi Naqvi, who kind of bridges the kind of partition era into the era of independence. And the family still remain very influential now.
Yeah.
And in that particular article, I sort of think about how this kind of genealogy of authority is continued. And I suggest it's based on a kind of intermingling of two concepts. There's this idea in Islam of hasab and nasab, the idea of kind of a mix of genealogy and vocation. And those two kind of reinforcing each other. So when a scholar conducts his religious practice, he's of course, achieving his status through his action, but also that's part of the family line of achievement. And so I think that particular story is carried through. It's also maybe particularly close to me because that family were so very helpful to me during my research in terms of the access they could give me to research materials, to contacts and so on. So while I discount the word favorite and I discount any sense of agreement with the family on everything, I think that there is a really interesting story there about a particular family. And if I sort of make one more point here, the book I wrote was very much based in the idea of a Shia community and the Shia ulama taking on a very communitarian role. And while I don't disagree with that thesis, I also think that what the book did not do so well was think about the ulama not in terms of their collective leadership, but actually in terms of their cross-generational family status. And so what I tried to do in the article I wrote about the Khandan Ijtihad is think instead about the very important ties of genealogy and ancestry that actually hold the ulama together within Shi'ism in particular.
Yeah. And it's also interesting of how this ancestry is based on, it's a patriarchal structure, but currently it's through the daughter now, the Qalb Jawad and all.
Exactly, yeah.
Of how the whole thing... in the last section, I would just want to highlight few points which I was stuck with while I was reading your book. So one is about, you mentioned that usually when you talk about South Asia, it's looked, from a Shi'i perspective, it's looked upon as a Ghulati structure, like somebody who believes in Imam being a divine status or Imam having superhuman qualities, and mainly even the speakers coming from South Asia are believed to be exaggerators in the divine status of Imam. But you mentioned that actually in South Asia in the 20th century, the best known history of the Imams were those that emphasize not their divine qualities, but their very human characteristics. This is completely different to what we see currently coming out from South Asia. So what do you think? What was it there actually? What was the reason behind this claim, and why was it?
Interesting. I mean, sure. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think whether or not my statement is correct might depend probably on the sources I was using. And of course, I was clinging particularly in my study to the high ulama, who of course may have one view of this that is quite different from a kind of popular Shi'ism. So to say that one perspective is more prominent than another might not be correct, and you can confute me on that, as you just have. So I'll accept that. What I will say is that there are kind of variances. It sort of struck me doing my book research that you would have these very sort of stories really of divination, of the presence of the imams, of, the taziyas carrying the presence of the imams, for example, stories of miracles associated with the imams. All of these things were clearly there at the popular level. But then, of course, you've got others like Ali Naqi Naqvi who really come up with, for want of a better word, a kind of much more Protestant idea of what Husain stands for. There are not miracles. There is the story of the sacrifice, but it's very much a more worldly story of a kind of a human being fighting adversity and therefore setting a message for mankind aside from the divinity. So there are different narratives, and those issues, again, I know that those debates are still very much alive within India, although I confess I haven't researched them in the post-independence period. They're also certainly there, and have been documented in some of the work on Pakistan Shi'ism, where there have been real debates about the extent to which, for example, taziyadari and ceremonials and miracles should be adhered to by Shi believers versus whether they should not. And there are very different tendencies and schools of thought within 12 Shi'ism over there.
Because this also aligns in closely with, you have also mentioned, is the Shia Azan controversy. Is the phrase Al-Yum Waliyullah wa Khalifatu Bila Fasl. In your book, you have said that this wasn't there before. It came on later on in the public discourse. This wasn't said during the Azan. And you mentioned the roots of Shi'a Azan lay not in India, of this Azan but actually in Safed and Qajar, Iran. So before that, because right now, people in South Asia, generally the Shi'i tendency would be like, this was part and parcel, this phrase was part and parcel of the history since the Shi'ism. But what you mentioned in the book was that this is fairly in the 18th or 19th century when it comes there.
I'd like to take a moment once again to commend you on the most detailed reading of my book that anyone has done in at least 10 years, if not ever. But yeah, having said that, I mean, again, I'm going on memory here, but this phrase about Ali being the Khalifa without usurpation, that was not standard practice in Awadh, because Awadh, of course, was held together as a very kind of tight regime that depended on both a Shi and a non-Shia social elite. And so for the most part, the kind of later Nawabs in Awadh tended to avoid anything that was openly controversial. So while such phrases might have been recited in private prayer or within, say, a private majlis, it was not issued, across the rooftops from the public minar, for example. It was in the kind of colonial period when you have a very different delineation of community that this starts to happen. And as I argue in the book, actually, it starts to appear not in kind of the major mosques in Lucknow. It happens inside mosques and not even in Lucknow. So this is an example of really the book's framework, which is that actually in the kind of urban public sphere of North India at the time, with all the opportunities for communication and finding a platform for one's own voice, kind of minor practices become almost, they find a sort of status within the public sphere and then sort of veer towards the majority. So, you have a phrase like that, which starts in a very sort of small regional mosque, but then becomes more kind of widely embedded and eventually becomes kind of a mainstream. Likewise, you have, new structures of mourning. You have later as well the sort of controversial recitation of Tabara, which becomes, again, starts as a very sort of controversial private practice, but then becomes public for kind of various reasons to do with the public expression of Shi'ism. So religious practice changes, and new forms of practice are brought out into public by virtue of new zakirs, new vais, and new reciters, new styles of azadari, all of which represent the kind of social changes happening in Shi'ism at that particular juncture.
It's very interesting because generally when we understand in that sense of the Aliyun Walillah or like these elements of Tabarra or saying it seems that South Asia may have been the source or epicenter of this. Whereas by your scholarship, as we see that it wasn't exactly like that, and how even in the main centers and how even there was some impact from the Qajar or Safed times that these elements also came into being in the Indian mainland in that sense. Because also as your book highlights that it was also dominated, the framework was also dominated by Usuli ulamas more than the Akhbari ulamas.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that shows.
I mean, the Akhbari the kind of Akhbari division, it really, by the time of Dildar Ali Nasir Abadi's hegemony over the structures of state, the Akhbari tendency sort of disappears, and he was very responsible for, effectively writing disputations, munaziri, against the Akhbaris. So that becomes a minority dispensation. I mean, I know it's still there in parts of India, like in the South India, but I remember one figure in Lucknow, when I asked him how many Akhbaris there were left in Lucknow, he said 13. And I said, 13 families? And he said, no, 13. And while I'm sure that can't be correct, it's effectively there is a kind of Usuli consensus in North India now.
Yeah.
In terms of what you're saying about where practices come from, and does say the Bila Fasil Azan come from India or does it come from Iran? I mean, any study of Shi'ism is absolutely rife with uncovering a series of contradictions, so you never really know. I mean, there were always, I always heard different things about where such a phrase came from. I heard different things about where Tabara emerged. I heard different things about where the custom of Taziyadari emerged. Did this come from Iran? Did this come from India? I heard the same about sort of the styles of, of kind of theatrical passion plays around Muharram. It's very hard to get to the bottom of things because there are so many contrary narratives. And it actually shows that in many cases, particular Shia communities will either kind of indigenize or embed a particular culture as their own, as something from their own history and their own progeny, or in some controversial cases they say, well, that's coming from outside. And getting to the bottom of any of these things is I think impossible, and I think I never fully managed. So one can find evidences, but there's never a solid answer to such questions.
I mean, that's the beauty of the ambiguity.
Absolutely, which is very useful for everybody in some cases.
Yeah, definitely. On that sense, as a reader of your book, I think anybody who reads your book right now in this world, in current times, definitely this question will come into their mind, is that when they look at this late period of coloniality and we see these madrasas, these mujtahids, these autonomous function, these debates, the lineage of scholars being produced, many mujtahids being produced, and now the current state, the decline in the madrasas, the community from being mujtahids is now reduced to being muqallids, the centers shifting.
Yeah.
In that sense, it may be termed as a kind of a decline of that autonomous nature of the community. What do you think? Because while you were doing it, this question might also have come into your mind as well, as to what was the history I'm reading and the present I'm living.
Yeah.
What would have been the reason for this decline?
Again, that's an extremely good question, and I'll pretext it by suggesting that I'm probably not in best place to answer this because this is so sort of modern, but I can give a few observations. So yeah, I think what my research has sort of proven is too strong a word, but what my research has alluded to is that there is this decline, and there's certainly a narrative that by the 80s and 90s, you have a series of factors which have suggested a particular decline for Shi'ism in North India. So you have the loss of Ali Naqi Naqvi, who was kind of often seen as kind of the last major mujtahid of the generation. But you've got the ascent of the influence of Iran. You've got the fact that a lot of organizations in India subsequently to that the debate has really been about whether the Shia should be the muqallids of, for example, al-Sistani, or whether they should be looking to the kind of post-revolutionary Iran as a kind of pole of leadership. So I think actually the debates about the ultimate marjiyat, the kind of ultimate leadership in Shi'ism, have shifted more back to the global. And I think there's many reasons for that. I mean, what I would probably say here actually is that there are frameworks for thinking about how South Asian Shi'ism might be positioned in relation to the rest of the kind of Shia world. And there's a really good book by Simon Fuchs, which is written about Pakistan. It's called In a Pure Muslim Land. It was published in about 2019. But I think actually the framework he uses, he's writing about Pakistan, but the framework could sort of be applied quite fruitfully to India in some ways as well. But he's looking at kind of the transnational traffic of ideas between the Shia in Pakistan and in the lands to the west, chiefly to Iran, Iraq, also Lebanon, and so on. And he suggests that there is actually a kind of circularity to this. So yes, of course, certain ideas relating to the revolution in Iran, for example, do influence, Pakistani Shi'ism. Pakistani Shias in the 80s started to intone the whole ideas of Wilayat al-Faqih. You have kind of overtly pro-Iranian Shia organizations emerging in India and Pakistan in this period. But at the same time, he says, this is not simply some kind of uncritical absorption of Iranian ideas, but actually these ideas are percolating in South Asia in new ways. The whole idea of the Wilayat is recrafted quite differently and quite cleverly once it encounters kind of the Urdu medium of education. And by virtue of kind of the traffic in both directions, Pakistani Shias are then traveling to Iran and not just bringing ideas back, but taking ideas there. So actually, there is a way of thinking about Shia leadership which does not simply cast South Asia to the periphery, but thinks about these kind of global networks of intellectual exchange across the Shia world. So he's done this for Pakistan. I would be interested to think about how the same might happen for Shi'ism in India. I have been to Iraq in the last couple of years, but one of the things that one picks up in Najaf and Qom is a far greater number of South Asian students who are going there, who are going to Najaf and Qom as students, as scholars, as pilgrims, and whatever. And so the influence is going in that direction as well. And so going back again to Simon Fuchs's argument, I think there is a way in which these movements could be thought of in a more circular way, rather than, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, a kind of concentric circles, which places Najaf at the center, which simply radiates to the periphery. I think it's more complicated than that.
Interesting. I hope it's... Well, I still, even if it's circular, in my personal opinion, I still don't believe it's balanced. It's still towards
Perhaps
the
not.
center.
Understood.
Moving on to the second last question. So in this field, when you started, I think there were really few books, and you must have faced this challenge as well of in the work of Shi'ism in South Asia. So what's happening in this field currently? How you mentioned one of the papers, but broadly, generally,
In Shia studies?
In Shia studies in South Asia.
Yeah. So when I started, I think I had what at that point was a luxury, which was the field was really quite wide open. And I could start with Juan Cole's book, which conveniently ended before mine started. And I had all this space in which to operate. Now, Shia scholars nowadays, the bad news is that space isn't there. But the good news is that means that there is a huge amount that has happened in the study of Shi'a Islam across South Asia in particularly the last 10 to 15 years. So, I mean, a few particular areas that one might mention. I mean, I've already mentioned Simon Fuchs's work on thinking about kind of the geography of religious leadership in new ways across South Asia, and this idea of kind of the sort of transactional nature of the ties between the ulama and the religious elites in South Asia and the rest of the kind of Shia world. So that's sort of one body of scholarship that's there. That's also tied into some other network on kind of Shia globalization that has been produced by Radhika Gupta and then a few others as well. So there's that whole kind of body of work. There's also been, again, focusing on 12er Shi'ism, a number of scholars who've really, done what I tried to do for Lucknow, but in other parts of India, where they've tried to get down to the granular level of everyday Shi'ism and how it works, how religious practice works, and so on. So, I mean, a few examples, Karan Ruffal's work on everyday Shi'ism, centered on Hyderabad, but that sort of engages, kind of the observance of Muharram through a series of lenses like visual culture, material culture. It's a kind of interdisciplinary work thinking about the life of ritual. There's also been those who've thought about kind of Muharram in relation to things like urban geography. So Razam Masoodi Najad, for example, has done several papers and has a forthcoming book on Muharram in Bombay, which is thinking about sort of, if you like, the thinking about Muharram in relation to the city, and the city as this space which is both about a kind of aspirational Shia identity, but there's also the city as it exists, and there's also the very regulated city of the modern Indian state, which determines how Tajdidari happens. So it's thinking about a kind of human geography perspective on Azadari. Patrick Eisenlohr has thought about, sort of used the ethics of anthropology to think about, Muharram-based soundscapes and, sort of visual landscapes and so on. So that's maybe in the same body of literature. So these have all been really rich works. I'd also mention Raza Khan's excellent work on Rampur State, which again is sort of filling a long-standing gap that I wish had been filled when I was doing my writing, because that's really sort of established, again, the workings of another Shia state. Another body of work that's maybe worth mentioning is the work on Ismaili Shi'ism, which I haven't really dealt with in my own research and which we haven't really talked about today. But that body of scholarship has leapt forwards again. So there is Tina Purohit's work on the Aga Khan case and the consolidation of the Ismaili community under effectively British legal governance in the 1860s. That's been really influential. There's also been a number of those who've worked on the kind of the transnational Ismaili community. So Suman Mukherjee has looked at the kind of Indian Ocean world of Ismaili communication and networks, particularly things like the Aga Khan Development Network as well. Who else? Kunal, what's his name?
Kunal Sharma.
Sharma. Yeah, so again, Kunal Sharma's work on kind of, Ismaili adjudication and the links between Isna Ashari and Ismaili Khojas in Bombay is really important. Also, my own doctoral student who recently finished, Imran Visram from Toronto, has done some really good work on the Ginan tradition in Ismailism and looking at kind of the language of the divine as it appears in the Ginans in a way that sort of combines Shi'ism with also Sufi and Hindu modes of understanding the divine, which engages a kind of religious studies translation theory. So, and this is just a start, really. So I think it's fair to say that there has been much more scholarly engagement with different facets of South Asian Shi'ism, both Isna Ashari and also Ismaili, in recent times. And there's also been a lot more academic networking around Shi'ism. So there are all these new platforms now of podcasts and the sharing of studies and journals dedicated to the study of Shi'ism. So I think it can only be a good thing, but this is a vibrant area, much more so than when I was doing my own research.
Well, there's the famous line by Iqbal, "मैं अकेला ही चला था जानिबे मंजिल, लोग आते गए, कारवां बढ़ता गया."
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't agree more. Well, except for my own role in that.
So the last question, which is specific to the Thinking Islam question, is we ask our guest is to not answer a question, but tell us what's their question currently.
Their question.
Yeah, what are you thinking about?
Okay. Right.
Generally, like your research or what?
Okay, well, that's a good and a big question, and one that I hadn't anticipated. So I'm just thinking, I'm just thinking on the spot at the moment. But as I've sort of mentioned a couple of times, my primary research interests are, for the time being at least, no longer directly linked to Shi'ism. But I've been looking much more, again, maintaining my focus on South Asia, at questions of rights in Islam. So I've worked a great deal with Muslim women in South Asia and Muslim women's organizations around questions of Islamic feminism, the interpretation of the Quran in a more kind of gender-friendly way. I'm also engaging in a series of projects at the moment about children's rights, particularly working again with NGOs. And I think this particular area that I've increasingly engaged in, which is working with the third sector, is sort of where my mind is at the moment. And so I think some of the questions I'm thinking about at the moment is around the ideas of the acceptability and the limits of the direct interpretation of religious texts. So in the way that, for example, Islamic feminism has sought to revisit teachings from the Quran, from the Hadith, how far that can be taken without, if you like, pulverizing the message, I think is sort of one of my main research concerns at the moment. And also the questions of rights. And it's sort of become very clear to me in some of my recent research that Islam has a very vibrant language of rights, of often haqq or haqooq. But that is, of course, very different from a kind of Western liberal notion of rights. It's often very protective. it's often about the fulfilling of obligations to others much more than about the individual interest as such. And so I think I'm playing around with that. But how far can there be genuine kind of symmetry between different discourses of rights? So it's not about whether one set is better than others, but how can that dialogue between an Islamic and a secular understanding of rights come to be? Now, I'm still working on those questions, so I'm not going to answer that, even if you ask me to. But that's a question, and that's probably where I'll leave it.
We look forward to you exploring this question and maybe eventually having a second podcast on this.
That's very kind.
Thank you so much. It is an absolute pleasure to listen to your thoughts, words, and explore more.
Thank you. And thank you again very much for your extremely detailed and granular research into my own work. I'm flattered.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for watching our episode. So this is not just one-way traffic. It's not us only telling you, but we'll be interested in knowing your views. So if you like the podcast, please hit the like button. If you have any thoughts or comments or questions, please put them down in the comment section. And please don't forget to subscribe and also keep watching Thinking Islam. Just think about it.